Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto gets hurt by Ino and becomes depressed for a long time, part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. A baby laughs at the funny face being made by its father, sending drool flying everywhere as it waves its chubby hands in the air. A mischievous young woman steals a tip from a recently deserted table. A fly buzzes quietly on the door to the restaurant, seemingly oblivious to the waitress approaching from behind with a rolled-up magazine. Ordinary things that a person usually ignores, but Naruto was aware of all of them, mostly because he was trying to avoid staring at the green-eyed woman sitting across the table. Hard to believe it's been half a year, huh? Sakura asked, chopsticks held lightly in her right hand. She and Naruto were currently grabbing dinner at a swanky new restaurant near the Hokage's mansion, relaxing after a grueling day of training with the Godime. Since the deaths of Sasuke and the Akatsuki, Tsunade had the two of them practically glued to her shapely hips, using whatever extra time she had available to teach them. More often than not, it involved the both of them reading old, musky books and writing research papers on what they'd learned. Naruto smiled half-heartedly. He was used to this conversation. Since Sasuke died, right? Sakura nodded her head, a faraway look on her face. Do you think he really killed himself? The blonde frowned. He didn't want to sound cruel, but he was sick of thinking about their wayward former teammate. After the initial news of his suicide, Naruto had refused to believe it. Sasuke may have been a lot of things, traitorous, evil, crazy, possibly gay, but suicidal wasn't one of them. As time wore on, though, he'd begun to question his initial opinion. How much had he really known about Sasuke? Sure, he'd at one time considered the Uchiha one of his closest friends, but he'd only been around him for a little under a year, 3 months of which were spent completely ignoring the other. Besides, even when they had become actual friends, it wasn't like Sasuke had ever told him anything about his family, besides how much he wanted to kill Itachi, anyway. No, he really didn't want to talk about him anymore. That part of his life was over. More importantly, he had something to ask the woman idly picking at her fish. He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled through his nose, deciding to take the plunge and get it over with. Nay, Sakura, if you're not doing anything tomorrow, you wanna go ice skating with me? The pond at the park's frozen over. Naruto bit the inside of his lip, trying hard not to look too interested. He thought there was a good chance that she'd accept his offer, but as his perverted former sensei used to say, women are illogical and insane. Sakura looked surprised for a couple of seconds, but to his relief, she smiled and nodded. Sure. Oh, but we have to do it before 6. I have a date tomorrow night. The chopsticks in his hand clattered against the floor. His body suddenly went cold, and his ears burned with an intense fire. The plate in front of him began to blur in and out of focus, causing the recently eaten food to churn and rumble in his stomach. He felt sick. Naruto, you okay? I have to go to the bathroom, Naruto said, standing up suddenly. The only emotion he could feel was shock. The news had literally blindsided him. Although she was attractive, Sakura had always had an unapproachable air about her. In the academy, she was too shy and withdrawn for anyone to notice her. When she became a genin, she was a crazed Sasuke fangirl. As a Junin medic nin serving directly under the Hokage, she was just scary. Who the hell had enough balls to ask her out? No, a better question might be who was suicidal enough. He numbly pushed open the door to the bathroom. Luckily, it was empty. He could imagine what his face looked like at that moment. He walked up to the sink and stared into the mirror, confirming his assumption. He looked like shit. The blonde tiredly lowered his head. What did he expect? Did he really think that with Sasuke gone Sakura would suddenly look at him? He should have known better. Just when he'd begun to believe that she was developing feelings for him. Just when he thought he'd finally found someone who really understood him, and liked him for more than his social status or fighting ability. Logically, he knew that she didn't belong to him. He'd never been able to work up the courage to ask her out, and she'd never said that she wouldn't date anyone else. Somehow, though, he still felt betrayed. Naruto lifted his head to stare into the mirror again, remembering the words he'd been told by an Anbu officer when he was a child. Just grin and bear it. Things will be brighter tomorrow, kid. He didn't know who said them or why those simple words made him feel better, but they did. That's right. Just grin and bear it. It's how he'd gotten through 17 years of his life, and it hadn't failed him yet. With that, he slowly began to piece together his mask. He cleared his throat and pasted on a smile, staring into the mirror to make sure it was correct. Since Sakura had been his friend for nearly 5 years now, his smile would have to be impeccable. Otherwise, she'd notice right away if something was bothering him. Satisfied that she wouldn't see through his grin, he took a deep, calming breath and headed back out to the dining room. He eased himself into his seat, doing his best not to look her directly in the eye. It was easy to put on a smile to hide his frown, but it was much harder to hide the look of anger and betrayal in his eyes. Are you all right? Sakura asked again, green eyes furrowed and concerned. Naruto bit back his shock. He was surprised that she was able to see the crack in his smile so easily. After a little thought, though, he realized that she may just be asking because he'd left too suddenly. It was okay. She hadn't actually noticed anything. Yeah, just tired. I had a long day. The medic nin stared at him for a few seconds, trying to figure out exactly what was going on. He wouldn't look her directly in the eye, and his posture looked more slumped than usual. Giving up, Sakura leaned back and placed her chopsticks on the table. Why didn't you say so? We can go home if you'd like. As if he'd been waiting for those words all night, Naruto quickly stood to his feet and reached for his wallet. We probably should. He felt his voice waver. Not good. Wanting to get out of there as fast as he could, he tossed a few bills on the table and walked towards the door. Naruto, wait up, Sakura called, digging through her purse for her wallet. Unfortunately, the blonde was already out of the restaurant, resisting the urge to run home. He didn't want to be around Sakura for another second. The feel of her hand on his shoulder almost made him vomit. Hey, what's the rush? He paused momentarily, debating whether or not to turn around. If he didn't turn around, she'd know for sure that something was up, but if he did turn around, he might not be able to keep his smile from crumbling. I'm just really tired. I want to get some sleep, he said, cursing himself for stuttering. Feeling his fatigue, she allowed her hand slip from his shoulder. Well, good night then, Naruto, she said, jade eyes still furrowed with concern. Unable to bring himself to answer, Naruto simply walked off towards his apartment, leaving a confused Sakura in his wake. Naruto trudged up the wooden stairs to his apartment, feet making a hollow thumping sound with each step. He wanted nothing more than to fall face first onto his bed and forget everything. Forget about stupid Sakura, forget about her stupid date, and while he was at it, forget about his stupid life. It's about time you got here, Uzumaki. Naruto snapped his head up to see an angry young woman standing in front of his apartment, arms crossed and travel pack hanging from her shoulders. A black duffel bag sat at her feet, spiking his curiosity as to her intentions. Finally finding his voice, he deepened his frown and leveled his gaze on the woman. What do you want, Ino? The kunoichi averted her gaze, instantly putting her fellow blonde on edge. That was never a good sign. Let me crash here for a couple of nights. You're the only one I know who has their own place, and my parents would never think to look for me here. He thought about it for all of 2 milliseconds. No. Shoving her out of the way, he jammed his key into the lock and opened the door. Just as he was about to close it behind him, Ino forced her foot in the doorway. Why not? Sakura told me that you have 2 bedrooms in this place, so it's not like I'll be in your way. She noticed his face crumble at the mention of Sakura and instantly felt a little bad for him. He looked like a lost puppy who'd just been separated from his mother. Hey, you alright? Go home. I'm not gonna take care of you. He kicked her foot out of the doorway and tried to close the door again, only to have Ino slide her torso halfway into his apartment. He was so shocked by her near-suicidal move that he paused for a second, giving her a chance to get one final word in. Dinner, she said, looking him straight in the eyes. A little caught off guard by the word, Naruto raised his eyebrows. What? Seeing that she had his attention, she quickly continued. I'll buy groceries and make you dinner every night for as long as I'm here. Can you even cook? Ino recoiled as if she'd been slapped, mouth opening in a shocked, oh. Are you serious? What makes you think that I can't cook? Naruto frowned. You don't seem like the useful type. Move it. Ino forced the door open and elbowed him out of the way. She looked around his apartment with disdain, mouth screwing up in obvious disappointment. It's smaller than I thought. And dirty. I guess it's better than those cheap motels on the south side of the village, though. Your kitchen's at the end of the hall, right? Without waiting for his answer, she skipped around the corner to the kitchen. Once there, she opened his refrigerator and stuck her head inside, only to find little more than a carton of milk and a few eggs. This is all you have. Naruto sighed loudly, feeling fatigue begin to claw at his body. After all he'd gone through that day, he didn't have the energy to argue with her. Letting the girl sleep in his place for the night wouldn't kill him. He closed the door and trudged down the hall towards his bedroom, loosening his clothing as he went. Noticing his departure, Ino pulled her head out of the refrigerator. So, can I stay? She yelled. No. He slammed the bedroom door behind him and fell limply on his bed, just barely slipping out of his clothes. He faintly heard the front door open and close, signaling the girl's departure. It was a bit surprising that Ino had given up so easily, but judging by the look on her face when she'd first stepped into his apartment, she wasn't too keen on staying anyway. He felt a little bad for not letting her stay since she had nowhere else to go, but hell, she was a shinobi. She could easily find a safe place to camp out in Konoha. Besides, the last thing he needed was a loudmouthed, spoiled princess hanging around when he was feeling so shitty. Putting the Yamanaka out of his mind, Naruto slowly shut his eyes, silently praying to Kami-sama that tomorrow would be brighter. Naruto woke with a start, body tense and wet with perspiration. His heart beat at 1,000 miles per second, threatening to pop out of his chest. A nightmare. He wasn't a stranger to waking up this way, not by a long shot. His childhood was filled with these kinds of mornings, and though they'd lessened over time, they had never completely gone away. Unlike usual, though, he could barely remember what had happened in his dream. The only 2 things that had managed to stick with him were a scream and a pair of blood-red eyes, both of which left him feeling more than a little sick to his stomach. He took a few more minutes to catch his breath before slowly rolling out of bed to start his day. He didn't really have anything to do. His initial plan had been to go ice skating with Sakura since it was his day off, but there was no way he could face her after what had happened the night before. Not without breaking down in front of her. Naruto slipped on a pair of loose brown shorts and a white t-shirt. He hadn't showered last night, but it didn't matter. It wasn't like he was planning on leaving his apartment. Deciding that he'd better at least eat something, Naruto trudged into his kitchen to see what he could find. If he remembered correctly, he still had a few cups of ramen in the cupboard and a couple of eggs left in the fridge. To his surprise, there was already someone standing in his kitchen. It took a few seconds, but he was eventually able to remember that Ino had asked to stay at his place for the night. Even though he thought he'd refused her, the woman apparently didn't know how to listen. He watched as Ino worked over his stove, seemingly unaware of his presence. She wore a loose white tank top over her torso and a pair of baggy gray sweatpants adorned her legs. Her long blonde hair was pulled back in her usual ponytail, but unlike her usual hairstyle, the long bang that usually hung in front of her right eye seemed to also be pulled back away from her face. "What do you think you're doing?" Naruto asked, eyes groggy and red as he stared at her. She glanced over her shoulder and glared at him as if it was obvious. "Making breakfast. I went out and bought some groceries. I figured that since I couldn't make you dinner last night, I should make it up by cooking breakfast. Sit down." He frowned in her direction, unsure of how to take her explanation. Her tone had been harsh and demeaning and she wasn't supposed to be here, but she was cooking him breakfast. Since it didn't smell too bad and he really wasn't in the mood for ramen at the moment, a rarity that he chalked up to his current emotional state, he decided to plop down in one of the two chairs sitting in the kitchen. He could kick her out after he finished eating. Ino set the table, placing a variety of dishes he'd only ever had in restaurants in front of him. She poured them both a cup of tea before seating herself in the chair opposite him, clasping her hands together and bowing her head. "Itadakimasu." Picking up his chopsticks, Naruto dipped his utensils into his rice bowl and brought them up to his face, discreetly checking the food to make sure everything was in order. He didn't believe she'd actually poison him, but it was more of a habit than anything. He'd learned his lesson after a certain incident involving a certain perverted hermit and a certain hooker at a certain brothel in a certain Earth country town. Yeah, that hadn't been very fun. Deciding that the food was safe, he shoveled some rice and vegetables into his mouth. Surprisingly enough, it didn't taste half bad. He packed in another mouthful, finding that it was getting better and better with each bite. Still, although the food was good, he couldn't let Ino stay with him just because she could cook a little. Placing his chopsticks on the table, he leveled his gaze on the kunoichi. "Why'd you run away from home? Right to the point, aren't you?" She joked, smirking at him. When his face remained unamused, she sighed and answered his question. "Well, you know how my dad works in terror and interrogation." Naruto didn't say anything, so she continued. "I asked him to help me get in, and he said that as long as I was under his roof he wouldn't allow me to apply. Apparently, it's too rough for a young woman of my constitution. Can you believe that shit? It's a total double standard." Naruto spared her a deadpan stare. That's it. That's it. When someone tells you that you can't do something, don't you get upset? I mean, where does he get off saying that it's too tough for me?" Her eyes were angry and wide, and her mouth was twisted into a vicious scowl. "He works in torture and interrogation and he's your father. I think he'd know." Ino shot him a glare. "Shut up." They ate in silence for a few minutes, neither of them all that interested in speaking with the other. Every now and then the kunoichi would glance up at Naruto, curiously studying him in an attempt to figure out why the village's loudest shinobi was so quiet. Unable to take it anymore, she slammed her chopsticks down on the table. "What's with you? You're not acting like Mr. Sunshine and Rainbows today." He gave her a tired, sarcastic smile before going back to his food. He wasn't terribly hungry, but he had to admit that the girl could cook. Damn, could she cook? It almost amazed him that a headstrong, annoying girl like Ino knew anything about housework, and it wasn't long before he was wolfing the rest of his meal down. Ino watched him eat with a knowing smile, more than a little pleased that he seemed to be enjoying himself. If the way to a man's heart was through his stomach, then she had a good chance of convincing him to put her up for more than the few days she'd initially suggested. She didn't know how long this cold war with her father would last, but she figured it'd be at least a couple of weeks before he finally caved. "Good?" she asked, trying as hard as she could not to sound smug. Naruto glared at her from over his cup of tea, finishing the drink before setting it back down on the table. It briefly occurred to him that this was the first time he'd seen her right eye since he'd left for his 3-year training trip with Jiraiya. It was okay. He stood from the table with his dishes, dropping them into the sink noisily. The woman bit back a laugh. He was so dishonest that it was almost cute. I'm glad you liked it. He grunted a response and headed to the bathroom to wash up. Unfortunately, he wasn't quite prepared for the sight that met him. His sink was literally covered with different and strange-looking bottles, most of the in funny shapes he hadn't known existed until now. It smelled distinctly of wildflowers, a scent he actually didn't mind too much. The thing that did bother him was how comfortable she'd gotten in his apartment in only one night. If he didn't know any better, he'd say that she was planning on staying longer than the few days she'd asked for. He debated whether or not to confront her about it, but at the moment, he really didn't feel like dealing with it. He was still feeling depressed about Sakura's betrayal, and all he wanted to do was mope around his apartment until he felt better. Sure, it wasn't the most effective plan, but doing anything else seemed too troublesome. Maybe this was how Shikamaru used to feel before Asuma died. After brushing his teeth and washing his face, he dragged himself out to the living room and flopped down on his couch, letting loose a heavy sigh. Seriously, what's up with you? Ino asked from the kitchen. I haven't seen you this upset since Jiraiya-sama. She quickly shut her mouth, noticing the way Naruto's face took on an even darker look. It doesn't have anything to do with you. Undeterred, Ino pressed on. Is it Tsunade-sama, Kakashi, Sasuke, Sakura? When Naruto's face soured, she rolled her eyes. Sakura. Huh, should have known. It's always about Sakura. She frowned in thought. What could Sakura have done to piss Naruto off so much? The only thing she could think of that would make him this upset is if Sakura went back to Sasuke after all that had happened. Since Sasuke was dead, it had to mean that he'd found about. Ah, the date, Ino said, not realizing that she was speaking out loud. Naruto snapped his head around to stare at her, shock prevalent on his face. You know about it. Sakura's like my best friend. Of course I know about it. Do you know who she's going on a date with? The girl smirked inwardly. This was it. This was the exact situation she'd been waiting for. A situation that could give her leverage. Well, I could tell you, but. Not realizing that he was falling into her trap, Naruto leaned forward with wide eyes. But what? In exchange you have to let me stay here for a week. Naruto blinked. A week. Living with Ino. The thought alone sent shudders down his spine. She'd already conquered his bathroom. What else would she take over before she was satisfied? His kitchen. His living room. Still, the curiosity was killing him, and he usually only came home to eat and sleep anyway. It wasn't like he'd be running into her very often. Sighing in resignation, he glared at the bossy kunoichi. Do I still get dinner? If he was gonna admit defeat, he wouldn't let her feel the satisfaction of completely getting one over on him. The woman smirked and nodded, smelling victory. Of course. Fine, but only a week. After that, you're gone. No exceptions. The woman rolled her eyes. I know. So. Ino's grin dropped slightly, and her face took on a mildly apologetic look. She's going on a date with Sai. She furrowed her brows when Naruto's mouth dropped open. Perhaps telling him was a little more than he could handle. After a few silent seconds, the young man was finally able to find his voice again. Sai. The Sai on our team. It surprised me too. Naruto's lip curled angrily, baring his fang teeth for Ino to see. That backstabbing. So, what are you gonna do? Find him and beat him up for going on a date with a single, available girl. He felt his anger deflate slightly. She had a point. But this is different. He knows how I feel about Sakura-chan. If you felt that strongly about her, you would have asked her out already. Ino snorted when his face fell. He was starting to look pathetic. However, she really didn't want to stay with a guy who moped around about one stupid girl. Sighing loudly, she crossed her arms in her hip. Look, it's just a date. I've been on 2 dates with the guy, and trust me, he doesn't have much to offer besides a pretty face. What? And you didn't marry him? Naruto bitterly asked. Ino frowned. Despite what you may think about me, looks aren't the only thing I look for in a guy. They have to have ambition, a personality, and treat me like I'm the only girl in their world. Settling for less isn't an option. So you want to be a princess? I'm trying to cheer you up and you're throwing it back in my face. No one asked you to cheer me up. Ino bit her lip harder than she ever had in her life. Every bone in her body was screaming for her to rip into him, demeaning and insulting him until there was nothing left of his small, pathetic ego. However, since she was living in his apartment for the time being and had no other friends to stay with, she decided to simply turn around and walk away before she said or did something she'd regret. Naruto watched her leave with a sigh. She just happened to choose the worst possible time to show up at his doorstep. He didn't feel particularly bad about snapping at her. It was her fault for poking her nose where it didn't belong, and if it kept her out of his business, and if he was lucky, apartment, then he was alright with playing the bad guy. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Ino, fully dressed in her usual shinobi garb, leave the apartment. She didn't bother to even glance his way, something that suited him fine. He leaned back on the couch and sighed again. Now he had to figure out what to do about Sakura. Solitary confinement, the breaking point, the effects of sensory deprivation. Ino, what is all of this? Sakura asked, staring down at the books Ino was steadily piling up in her arms. The blonde let loose a short breath of annoyance, already seeing where this conversation was going. The two of them were currently in the Konoha library, perusing stacks upon stacks of seemingly endless amounts of books. Each of the Junin already had an armful of material, and the Yamanaka showed no signs of slowing down. I'm going to apply for employment within the Terror and Interrogation Department, Ino mumbled. Eyes instantly lighting up, Sakura nudged her friend in the shoulder with a grin. Your dad approved. Ino, that's awesome. When Ino averted her gaze, Sakura's excitement dropped. Quote. Your dad didn't approve. The blonde grabbed another book from the shelf and huffed. He can't control my life. You're still living at home, so technically, he can, Sakura said, raising an eyebrow. For the second time Ino avoided the medic nin's eyes, instantly worrying her friend. You're still living at home, aren't you? When she didn't answer, Sakura put her books down on a table and crossed her arms in front of her. Ino, where are you staying? Exasperated, Ino also set her books down. Would you stop trying to pry into every detail of my life? Sakura wisely backed away, staring at her friend with concern. It was normal for Ino to be bitchy, but she was quickly moving into the realm of actual anger. Are you okay? The blonde sighed and rubbed her forehead with her palm, forcing herself to calm down lest she do something she regret. Even though Sakura was being annoying, it was only because she cared. I'm just stressed. Obviously. Ino shot Sakura a playful glare before seating herself at the table and reaching for a book. She'd initially planned to hop into the minds of some of the lower-level employees in the Terror and Interrogation Department to get an idea of what was on the test, but after her falling out with her father, she decided to show both him and herself that she could do it on her own without help from her clan's abilities. She'd gathered the books based on the information she'd managed to glean from her father over the years. From what she could tell, the most important thing about working in interrogation was knowing how to deal with each individual criminal. It relied on her being able to find and exploit a person's weak point within hours, a skill that took years to perfect. Not that she was actually expecting to be allowed to interrogate prisoners right away. She'd probably be relegated to desk duty or something for a few years, and after that, they'd make her a prison guard. If she was lucky, she'd be able to get to the good stuff at the 5-year mark. For nearly half an hour, Ino read over the books she'd picked out, every now and then pausing to write down the points that she felt were most important. Eventually her mind began to wander, and before long, she found herself thinking about Naruto. She was still a little pissed at him for taking his anger out on her, but she could sort of understand his pain. Sai had stolen Sakura out from under him, and despite what she'd told him the day before, she had to admit that it was an incredibly bitch move. It annoyed her, but she was getting less and less upset with Naruto. Remembering his sullen face, she winced and raised her eyes to look at Sakura. So, just out of curiosity, why did you agree to go out with Sai? She asked, trying not to sound too interested. Without even looking up from her own book, Sakura shrugged. Because he asked me. Did you change your mind about me dating him? I'll cancel if it bugs you. No, it's not that. I'm just curious. You're his teammate. You know better than anyone what he's like. Sakura shrugged her shoulders again. I know, but it's only fair that I give the guy a chance. Who knows? He might have this whole other, deeper side to him. They stared at each for a few seconds before simultaneously bursting into laughter. Sakura was the first to get a grip on herself, and wiping the tears from the corners of her eyes, she continued. But seriously, he offered to pay and it was a free meal. Are you sure you're alright with it? Ino nodded and smirked. She didn't particularly know why, but she was relieved to hear that Sakura didn't feel anything for Sai. Positive. Now, help me study. Slipping on a huge t-shirt and tying her hair up into a loose ponytail, Ino sighed in dismay as she looked around her large room. Naruto's guest bedroom was dead empty save for a few of his books and scrolls that she'd thrown into the closet. There was no dresser, no mirror, no bed, nothing. The idiot didn't even have an extra futon, giving her a clear picture of how often guests stayed over at his apartment. Luckily, she'd had the foresight to pack her sleeping bag just in case she wasn't able to find a place to sleep for the night and had to camp outside somewhere. She glanced over at her travel pack resting snugly against the wall. Thanks to the effective packing techniques they'd learned in the academy, she had enough clothing to last her for around 2 weeks, barring any unforeseen circumstances, anyway. She had yet to find a laundromat in the area, but it wasn't like she'd been looking all that hard. If things between she and Naruto ever improved, she could always ask him where he did his laundry. Sighing loudly, she pushed herself to her feet and stretched her arms toward the ceiling. She was tired from studying all day, but she still had to hold up her end of the deal by cooking dinner. Naruto didn't seem particularly picky about what he ate, so she could throw something together and he'd probably be satisfied with it. Ino shuffled out of her room towards the kitchen, dark gray sweatpants dragging the ground. She glanced towards the couch to see that Naruto hadn't moved an inch since she'd gotten home from the library. Hell, as far as she knew, he hadn't even moved since she'd left that morning. She rolled her eyes and opened the refrigerator, sighing again as she put together a meal in her mind. Since she'd bought fish on sale the day before and it was due to expire the next, she decided to cook it first. She also grabbed an armful of vegetables and chopped them up to make a simple side dish, sautéing them in one of his seemingly barely used frying pans. As she cooked, her eyes occasionally strayed to her fellow blonde staring blankly at the wall. She couldn't really understand what he was so bummed about. Sure, the girl he liked was going on a date with another guy, but it wasn't like they were getting married or anything. Over 80% of all relationships were destined to fail, and since the guy she was dating was Sai, that percentage jumped to 99%. If it was anything like her own dates with him, Sakura probably wouldn't even get through the first 10 minutes before sending the black-haired boy through a wall. Ino shook her head, exasperated with herself for even caring. She had enough problems of her own without worrying about Naruto's. She turned off the stove and poured the soup into a couple of bowls. It was only a simple meal of rice, miso soup, sautéed fish, and vegetables, but it was probably more than enough to make him happy. You can eat, Ino called from his table, already seated. She gave him a few seconds, but when he didn't move, she frowned and narrowed her eyes. Uzumaki. Come eat. Now. He looked over and gave her a look that clearly said, seriously. Not budging, she pointed to his seat and deepened her glare. They held a fierce staring contest for a few seconds, neither willing to back down. Unfortunately, Naruto's stomach chose that exact moment to growl loudly, pretty much costing him the battle. He grudgingly stood to his feet and walked over to his seat, ignoring the triumphant smirk Ino was sending his way. After plopping down in his chair, he grabbed his chopsticks and began to eat, not bothering to say grace or even thank her for the food. As soon as Naruto placed a piece of the fish into his mouth, his taste buds exploded with flavor. The meal hadn't looked like much at first glance, but just like the night before, Ino had managed to make something that actually tasted good. The surprise must have shown on his face because the woman sitting across from him leaned forward with a knowing grin. Good. Naruto scowled and looked away, annoyed that he'd allowed her to read him so easily. Why do you keep asking that? Shouldn't you know if the food you cooked is edible? He grumbled. It boosts my ego and assures me that my taste buds haven't gone to shit. When Naruto smirked, she gasped exaggeratedly and widened her eyes. What's this? Mr. Mopey finally cracked a smile. She teased, adjusting her voice to sound as if she were a kindergarten teacher conversing with a student. Shut up. Despite his harsh words, both his face and tone betrayed his true feelings. It was obvious that his mood had improved since that morning, and it further proved her mother's theory that all men needed to be happy was good food and, unfortunately for Naruto, all he'd ever be able to get is the good food part. A low mumble snapped her out of her thoughts, and she glanced up to see Naruto staring down into his bowl of soup. What? She asked, curiously tilting her head. Naruto shifted uncomfortably, refusing to look her in the eyes. Sorry. Ino, pleasantly surprised that he'd had the decency to apologize, smiled and shook her head. It's okay. What are you doing? Naruto asked, yawning as he scratched at his unruly blonde hair. Ino was lying back on his couch in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, bare legs propped up on a huge pile of books. Her face was screwed up in concentration as she read, light blue eyes narrowed into determined slits. Unwittingly, his eyes traced the smooth contours of her thighs before quickly darting back up to her face. Studying. For what? To apply for the torture and interrogation department. I have to score at least an 80 to even try out. Ouch. Naruto mumbled, visibly wincing. You're telling me. Breakfast is on the table if you want it, she said, waving towards his small dining room. Naruto glanced over to see that there were a few dishes littering his table, a sheet of plastic wrap draped over them to presumably keep any bugs or dust from getting in the food. Breakfast. I thought the deal was just for dinner. Ino shrugged her shoulders. Don't get used to it or anything. My mom usually cooks at home, so I wanted to use this chance to work on my cooking skills a bit. Think of yourself as my guinea pig. In truth, she'd actually been pleased that her cooking had managed to cheer him up. It wasn't often that she was appreciated for, well, anything, and it was a surprisingly good feeling. Wanting to feel more of it, she had woken up half an hour early just so that she'd have a little time to throw something together for him. Thanks. For the first time since they'd begun speaking, Ino dropped her book to her lap to shoot him a shocked expression. What? Thanks. I guess you're feeling better about Sakura. Naruto's face noticeably darkened. I was. Sighing for what felt like the millionth time that week, Ino rolled her eyes. It was seriously just a date, Uzumaki. I talked to Sakura yesterday, and she saw it as more of a free meal than anything. Really? Really? Like I said, I've dated the guy. Even you have more to offer personality-wise than he does. Naruto scowled. Hey. Ino ducked behind her book, hiding her smile from view. Just as quickly, she wiped the smile from her face completely. What the hell was she acting coy for? Besides the bone-chilling fact that it was Naruto, the idiot probably wouldn't even realize what she was doing. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to habit and returned to her book, fully intending to block her fellow Junin out of her mind. Unfortunately, she was only able to get 10 or so minutes of silence before he spoke again. I wonder how her date went. Groaning, Ino slammed her book down into her lap. You're seriously way too obsessed with forehead, You know that. Despite herself, she felt a wry smirk appear on her face. But, it's kind of sweet how fixated you are on her. In a creepy, overbearing kind of way. Naruto paused momentarily, seemingly thinking her statement over. After a couple of seconds, he narrowed his piercing blue and leaned forward. Are you insulting or complimenting me? Both. Good to know. He stood from the table and put his dishes in the sink. I have to meet with Ba-chan today, and probably won't be back until late. Lock the door if you leave. Without sparing him another glance from over her book, Ino lifted a hand and threw him a half-hearted salute. Roger that. Quote. Say that again. Standing in the office of the Godime Hokage, Naruto was flabbergasted. He had initially assumed that she just wanted him to run errands or something, but unfortunately, it turned out to be more than that. Much, much more. Hoping he'd misheard her, he eagerly awaited her reply. I want you to take the application test for the torture and interrogation department next week, Tsunade repeated, glaring at him from over her threaded fingers. What? Why do I have to take it too? Tsunade furrowed her brows. Whoops. Ino had wanted to keep that a secret. If Tsunade knew about Ino's dad refusing to allow her to take the exam, she may also try to get in her way. Even worse, the Hokage might start asking questions about how he was involved with the Yamanaka, and that could lead to a very, very, unpleasant situation. I'm not interested in torture or interrogation at all, though. Naruto yelled, quickly circumnavigating her question. The Godime frowned. The more you understand about Konoha's internal affairs, the better prepared you'll be if you somehow manage to become the Hokage. I also want you to get a legitimate score. You don't have to pass it, but I expect you to get at least a 70. Naruto's jaw dropped. A 70? That was only 10 points lower than the score needed to pass. Even worse, he'd never been good at tests. The Chunin exams were a tremendous reminder of this. She handed him a flat manila envelope, glaring straight into his eyes as she did so. Got it. Frowning, the Junin scrunched up his face and nodded, snatching the envelope out of her hand. It wasn't like he really had a choice in the matter. Fine. Good. Now get out of my sight. He stuck his tongue out at her and turned on his heel, annoyed that she was making him do something so unreasonable. He could kind of understand her point of view, but at the same time, he really didn't want to spend the next week poring over dozens of books. He'd much rather be out on an A-ranked mission or training. Just as he was exiting the office, a bright pink blob entered his peripheral vision. Groaning inwardly, he recognized the blob as Sakura. Naruto. Hey, she said, popping up in front of him. Her bright green eyes sparkled as she looked up at him, making the blonde's heart jump painfully in his chest. I haven't seen you around lately. Is everything alright? Yeah, everything's fine, Naruto said, smile wide and eyes closed into slits. Sakura frowned and tilted her head. There was obviously something up with him, but if he wasn't going to spill, there was no point in prodding him any further. When he wanted to, Naruto could be a cast iron safe. Well, alright then. Wanna grab lunch? Normally, he'd have jumped all over her offer. Normally, there was nothing that would stop him from joining her for a meal. However, things were hardly normal between them. Avoiding her gaze, he declined. I had a big breakfast. Which was the truth. Ino hadn't held back at all, and since she'd gone through the trouble to make it for him, he felt obligated to finish everything. Sakura lifted an eyebrow. What? 10 bowls of ramen? Naruto, that stuff is loaded in sodium. It'll kill you if you keep eating it like that. She reached out towards his face, but to her surprise, Naruto edged out of her reach. I'd better start studying if I want to get a 70 on that test, he mumbled, turning in the direction of the Konoha library. Are you avoiding me? Sakura asked, staring at his back as he began to walk away. Just because I have a life of my own doesn't mean that I'm avoiding you. The kunoichi's eyes widened in surprise. Naruto had never taken such a cold tone with her before. Now she was sure of it, There was definitely something wrong with him, and it was only a matter of time before she found out what it was. Naruto opened the door to his apartment, both mentally and physically tired from the hours he'd spent combing the library for the books on the list Tsunade had given him. Half of them had already been checked out the day before, and after a little thought, he realized that it was probably Ino who had grabbed most of them. Hearing him come in, Ino popped her head out from the kitchen. Uzumaki. Dinners, holy crap. She stared in surprise at the huge stack of books in his arms, not expecting Naruto of all people to be interested in studying. What are all those for? Naruto snorted and frowned. Yeah, you know that test you're taking. Ba-chan's making me take it too. No way. Do you have any idea how tough it is? Ino asked, visibly shocked by his admission. No, but thanks for helping to build my confidence. I feel so much better about it now. On the bright side, I now have all the books that I need. She said, digging through his stack. Can you believe there's a 10-book checkout limit? He glanced at the books littering his coffee table and raised his eyebrows. But you have, like, 20. Sakura checked out some books for me under her name. This is seriously great, though. We can study together. Naruto rolled his eyes. Woohoo. Ino stopped looking through his books to glare up at him. You're a real downer, you know that. You're the one who's excited about studying. At least I'm trying to achieve my dream. And I'm not. Well, I'm not crying about having to study for things I'll have to know anyway. You were just crying about it this morning. Was not. Were to. Was not. Were to. Was not. Not. Were to. Was not. Not, times 1,000. Were to, times 1,000,000. Were not, times infinity. Were to, times triple infinity plus 1. Was. Ino paused and blinked. What am I? 6. Look at what you're making me do. You started it. Did not. Did to. Did not. Did to. Did not. Did. Ino stamped her foot, annoyed that she'd gotten drawn in by him again. Damn it, Uzumaki, would you stop being so immature? Despite her words, though, she had to admit that it was sort of fun arguing about nothing for once. The food's getting cold. Naruto grumbled and set his books down on the coffee table along with Ino's. He then sat down at the table, picking up his chopsticks and digging into his dinner. As soon as he took the first bite, he put down his chopsticks and stared down at his bowl. What is this? He asked, eyes wide and face incredulous. The question had apparently come off the wrong way as Ino frowned and glared at him. If you don't like it, don't eat it. But I like it. I wanna know what it is. Ino sat back a little, presumably in surprise. Oh, it's called katsudon. It has pork, egg, rice, and a bunch of different spices you don't have in your kitchen. Seriously, how the hell have you survived until now without even salt? And how have you never had of katsudon? Naruto shrugged and shoved another mouthful of food down his throat, brushing off her question. This is really good. She watched him eat in fascination. To her, it tasted average at best. She'd never considered her cooking skills to be anything amazing, but the way he was wolfing it down made her feel incredibly good. She actually kind of liked cooking when it was so greatly appreciated. Raising his eyes to stare at her, Naruto frowned. Aren't you gonna eat? Huh, oh, yeah, she stuttered, a bit embarrassed that she'd been caught. She picked up her utensils and began to eat, trying as hard as she could not to watch Naruto. You know, you're not as bad as I thought you were, Naruto said after a few minutes of silence. Ino lowered her chopsticks and tilted her head in curiosity. Bad. Like, I don't know, bitchy. Loud. Annoying. Self-centered. Had a few. I get the point. Thanks for having such a low opinion of me, she grumbled, face showing her displeasure. Hey, I'm just going by what I saw at the academy. After we were split into teams, we didn't really see each other anymore, and when we did, it was either with the rest of the Konoha 12 or for only a few minutes here and there. It's not like we've ever really had a conversation until now. Looking back, she realized that Naruto was right. She'd always considered him as sort of a friend, but how good of a friend was she if she didn't even talk to him? In fact, everything she knew about the teen was learned from Sakura, and that wasn't exactly the most legitimate of sources. It's not too late to get to know each other. She put down her chopsticks and extended her hand across the table. Hi, I'm Yamanaka Ino. Naruto stared at her hand for a few seconds, seemingly confused by the sudden gesture. Eventually his face broke out into a wide grin, and he tightly gripped her hand in his. Uzumaki Naruto. Pen poised readily over her notebook, Ino quickly scanned the lines of a particularly thick book, looking for the things on the list sitting on the coffee table in front of her. Thanks to the god, I'm giving Naruto a cheat sheet containing most of the things that would be on the test. Her study time had literally been cut in half. Her eyes quickly shot from her book to the blonde studying on the other end of the couch. The night before, she and Naruto had had a surprisingly long conversation about, well, everything. People they knew, missions they'd been on, dreams, nightmares, everything. The two of them had talked well into the early hours of the morning, and the only reason it ended when it did was because Naruto's words had begun to slur and run together. Apparently 3 in the morning was his cutoff point, and it was amusing to watch his chin fall into his chest every few seconds as he tried to stay awake. There had been almost no awkward silences. When one of them stopped talking, the other would jump in immediately with an opinion or story of their own, keeping things going at a frantic, feverish pace. She idly rubbed at her jaw, a bit surprised that it was actually sore from talking so much. She could gab with the best of them, and this was the first time she could remember this ever happening. Her eyes wandered to the clock on the wall, and eyes widening, she realized that it was 2:45. Oh, shit, she yelled, hopping to her feet. Concerned, Naruto snapped his head up to stare at her. What? I'm supposed to meet Sakura at 3. She said it was important. Naruto frowned and threw his book on the coffee table, visibly pouting at the fact that she was leaving. Noticing this, the kunoichi raised her eyebrows. You can keep studying, Ino said, tidying up her area. It's no fun studying by myself, he grumbled, poking out his lower lip. I won't be back for a few hours. What are you going to do with yourself until then? He shrugged his shoulders and leaned back on the couch, eliciting an exasperated sigh from his temporary roommate. Oh, quit moping. I'll be back in time to make you dinner. Okay. When Naruto didn't respond, she rolled her eyes and walked into her room to change. Just when she was starting to see him a new light, he reverted back into the same, immature Naruto she'd always known. After cleaning up and getting dressed, Ino hurried to the door and opened it, glancing over her shoulder to look at him. Later, she said, waving her hand in his direction. Predictably, Naruto didn't say anything, preferring to simply stare blankly at the wall. Rolling her eyes one last time, Ino walked through the door and closed it behind her, leaving him to stew in his own irrational anger. Sai asked me to be his girlfriend. Ino choked on her tea, nearly spurting the warm liquid all over the table. She and Sakura were currently sitting near the window in the same new cafe they'd been in earlier that week, enjoying a cup of black tea and a plate of cookies. Or, at least they had been enjoying them until the Hokage's apprentice dropped the bombshell of all bombshells. What? That Sai wants you to be his girlfriend? What did you say? Sakura shrugged her shoulders. Well, we had fun on the date, so. I agreed. The blonde stared at her friend in complete and utter shock. But, he's Sai, the one who called you an ugly bitch. Remember that? Oh, come on, Ino. That was like 2 years ago. He wasn't used to human contact back then. Maybe so, but, sensing that there was a bigger reason behind Ino's reluctance to accept their relationship, Sakura went on the offensive. Why are you so against this, anyway? Are you sure you don't still have feelings for him? Shocked by the accusation, Ino quickly opened her mouth to defend herself. It's not me, but Naru, shit. She'd almost given up Naruto's secret. Not that it was much of a secret to everyone else but Sakura, apparently. What? Her friend pressed, leaning forward as if she smelled blood. I just think that you need to put a little more thought into this. Sai is not good for you. I don't know why he's taken such a sudden interest in you, but you will regret this decision. Sakura leaned back and frowned, crossing her arms indignantly. Just drop it. I thought you'd be a little happier for me, but I guess I was wrong. Ino sighed and tiredly placed her palm against her forehead. Sakura. She honestly couldn't understand her friend's thought process. There was no possible way that she didn't know about Naruto's crush on her, and for her to completely ignore his feelings was just, well, low. Especially given their history together. Still, it wasn't her problem, and there was no sense getting Sakura upset when it didn't even concern herself. Whatever, you're right, let's just drop it. From there the conversation fell into the usual gossip about who was screwing who, but all Ino could think about was the boy sitting at home alone, oblivious to the news she would impart on him later that evening. Slowly opening the door, Ino hoped against hope that Naruto had somehow gotten tired and decided to go to bed a few hours early. Unsurprisingly, he hadn't. You're back. What did Sakura want? How did her date with Sai go? Did you ask? Naruto asked, hopping around her like a puppy greeting its master. Ino winced. Watching him wag his tail made her even more reluctant to tell him, and knowing his personality, she smiled and headed for the kitchen first. She figured the news would be easier to swallow on a full stomach. I'll tell you about it after dinner. Frowning, Naruto followed. Why can't you tell me now? Ino didn't answer, so he sped up until he was walking side by side with her. Nay, Ino, what did she say? Again she ignored him, and again he sped up until he was standing directly in front of her, backtracking as they walked into the kitchen. Ino, why are you? Annoyed, Ino turned her head to glare at him. Fine. You really want to know? Sakura and Sai are going out. For a few seconds, Naruto didn't move. His face was oddly devoid of any emotion, scaring her a little. Normally, this was the point where a person snapped. She'd seen it happen at least half a dozen times on missions, and while she was almost certain that he wouldn't do anything stupid, one could never be sure when it came to a shinobi. Swallowing roughly, she pasted on a grin. So, what do you want for dinner? You can name anything you want, but I can't guarantee its taste if it's something I've never made before. His face finally changing, the young man frowned and turned his head away. No thanks. I'm not that hungry. Ino sighed loudly. Come on, Naruto, it's not the end of the world, she said, reaching her hand out in an attempt to comfort him. He backed away from her and glared down at his feet. Forget it, I don't care anymore. Naruto. I said forget it. A tense silence followed his outburst, both of them equally shocked by his tone. Gritting his teeth, Naruto stalked off towards his room, slamming the door behind him. Ino frowned. She tried to be nice. She tried to hold back her temper. However, his passive-aggressive bullshit attitude was really starting to piss her off. Being yelled at and disrespected were two of the few things that she didn't tolerate, and the only reason he was still breathing was because she knew exactly what he was feeling at the moment. It annoyed her, but in a sick, twisted sort of way, she was happy to see that he could feel something other than happiness. Naruto had always come off as an incorrigibly chipper guy, a person who didn't have any worries and wasted time chasing after impossible dreams. He actually seemed like a human now. Unable to believe what she was about to do, she walked into the kitchen and began to look through the cupboards for some flour. Since she liked to eat her favorite foods whenever she was feeling down, ice cream, fried beef, cake, deep-fried pickles, she figured Naruto would be the same. She'd never tried making ramen from scratch before, but hopefully, the gesture alone would be enough to cheer him up. At the very least, she could try to take advantage of his current mental state to suit her own selfish needs. She spent the next hour measuring, cutting, chopping, and cooking the dish, actually putting some effort into making him some ramen. When she finished, she smiled and placed the steaming bowl on a tray before walking towards Naruto's bedroom. Rather than knock first, she simply twisted the doorknob, unsurprised to find it unlocked. The effect of slamming a door was significantly lessened if a person paused long enough to lock it behind them, after all. Ino used her shoulder to push the door open all the way, flooding the dark room with light. Giving her eyes a few seconds to adjust, she was eventually able to pick out Naruto's shadowed form on the bed. She sat down next to his head and put the tray down beside her. "Eat something. I made you ramen," she said, hoping the mention of his favorite food would be enough to get his attention. The young man murmured something that sounded suspiciously like, "Get out," and rolled over, turning his body away from her. Unperturbed, Ino grabbed his shoulders and rolled him back over until he was facing her again. "I'm not leaving until you talk to me." Their eyes met in a fierce staring battle, both too stubborn to be the first one to back down. Realizing that the kunoichi wasn't going to leave until he spoke, Naruto sighed and averted his gaze. "Why sigh?" he mumbled after a few seconds, deciding to get what was bothering him off of his chest. Pleased by her small victory, she decided to share a little bit of her knowledge with him. "I'm going to tell you something that very few guys know, and even fewer women are willing to admit. Women are illogical." Naruto almost laughed. It was the exact same thing Jiraiya had been telling him for years. "No shit." Annoyed by his interruption, she shot him a scowl. "Just listen to me for a second. Sometimes, even we don't understand the things we do or why we feel the way we feel. But isn't that true for men, too? Why do you like Sakura? Why don't you like Hinata instead? Or Tenten? Or even me? What's so special about her?" When he turned his head away to stare up at the ceiling, she knew she was getting through to him. Before he could come up with something else to say, she quickly continued. "There's nothing you can do to make her look your way. All you can do is become the best man that you can be, and do it for yourself. If it's meant to be, she'll turn around and see you. If it's not, she won't. That's how life is. And remember, I used to chase after Sasuke, so I know what I'm talking about." She let her words soak in for a few seconds, carefully watching his face for any sign of change. This was the turning point. Either he would listen to her and cheer the up, or he would completely disregard her argument and continue to mope. "I'm hungry." Happy that she'd gotten through to him, Ino smiled and placed the tray on his lap as he sat up, removing the lid of the bowl for him so that he could eat. She watched him slurp down a few mouthfuls of noodles, eagerly studying him for his reaction. Sure, she could make katsudon or grilled fish and he'd like it since he'd probably never eaten that much of it, but this was ramen. If there was one thing Naruto knew about, it was ramen. "It's pretty good. Not as good as Ichiraku's, but pretty good." Relief flooded through her. In truth, it had only been her second time making ramen, and the first time, her mother had been there to make sure she didn't mess anything up. Still, she couldn't let him know that. "Of course it is. You think you'd learn by now that there's nothing I'm not good at." Naruto lifted his head and shot her a wide smile. "Thanks, Ino." Staring into his happy, cerulean blue eyes, Ino felt her chest tighten. The feeling wasn't new to her, but for her to feel it while looking at Naruto didn't make any sense. She shook her head and pushed it to the back of her mind. "So, I guess this would be a bad time to ask if I can stay another week." Despite all she'd said a few days ago, Naruto was still moping around the house. It wasn't blatant, but he still refused to go outside unless absolutely necessary, preferring to stay inside and study. Not that she minded. In fact, she liked having him around as a study buddy, if only because watching him concentrate helped to keep herself focused. The only complaint she had was the fact that he insisted on sighing every few minutes. Unable to take it any longer, she slammed her book shut and looked up at him. "Naruto, if you're still upset about Sakura and Sai." Before she could finish, Naruto hopped to his feet and stretched his arms towards the ceiling. I'm hungry. You want some ramen? Ino rolled her eyes. He wasn't even trying to be subtle about the fact that he didn't want to talk about it. Yeah, I'll take a cup. Shrimp if you have it. The test is in 5 days. You feel ready? Naruto asked, grabbing a couple of ramen cups from the cupboard and putting the kettle on the stove. The kunoichi nodded her head, a small grin appearing on her face. Thanks to the study guide from the Godime, I might even be able to get 100 on it. Do you think I'll get in trouble if she finds out? I mean, I kind of have an unfair advantage over everyone else taking this test. It's only alright for you since you're not actually trying to join the department. Nah, Ba-chan knows you're capable of passing on your own. Besides, it's not like we had the answer key or anything. We still had to study our off to be ready for this test. I mean, most people have probably been preparing for months to take this thing. I guess you're right, she murmured, feeling a little bit better about it. He seemed to have that effect on people. Have you spoken to your parents? Trying to get rid of me? She asked, smirking in his direction. Shortly afterwards, Ino's face soured. I talked to my mom a couple of days ago. Apparently, she's been looking everywhere for me, and she demanded to know where I was staying. You didn't tell her, did you? Naruto asked, face taking on a nervous frown. Of course not. What would I say? Oh, don't worry mom, I'm living with this young, cute guy you know almost nothing about. Cute? Naruto asked, lifting an eyebrow. Ino tilted her head and looked him over. Well, you're sort of cute in your own way, but I'm just exaggerating to illustrate my point. It wouldn't go over too well if I told her truth. The whistling from the teapot interrupted their conversation, and Naruto quickly turned away to remove it from the stove. He poured the water into the 2 styrofoam cups and set them on the counter between them, glancing at the clock on the wall so that he'd know exactly when the 3 minutes it took to cook ramen were up. Looking back at Ino, he continued their conversation. If your dad really wanted to find you, he could. The Yamanaka rolled her eyes. I'm aware of that. Why hasn't he come looking for you yet? It's been almost a week since you've been staying here. She shrugged her shoulders. That's how he is. Even if he's worried sick, he's way too stubborn to give in and come looking for me. Which works out in both of our favors, because he'd probably hop into your mind and make you jump off of the Hokage monument if he found out we were living together. Naruto noticeably blanched. Why am I putting you up again? Because you like to watch me prance around your house in short shorts and a tank top. Ino teased. Wait, you knew. Ino paused, unsure of whether or not he was joking. His face looked completely serious, further piquing her curiosity. Unable to take it anymore, she ignored her common sense and asked. Really? An awkward silence settled over the both of them. Had she simply laughed his question off, things would have continued as usual. They'd both have continued on joking and eating, neither one of them dwelling on his words. As it was, Naruto's face took on a surprised look, and his mouth opened and closed a few times as he fought to think up something to say. There was no real way to answer her question. While he didn't actively stare at her, he could admit that his eyes had run over her legs, chest, and butt a few times. After all, he was a man. His heart may not have been particularly interested in Ino, but his body was. Still, he couldn't tell her that. Grabbing and swallowing his ramen in a few long gulps, he tossed the empty cup into the trash can and walked off towards his room as casually as he could manage. I'm gonna go take a nap. Ino watched him leave with a frown. What was that? Had he really been checking her out without her noticing? She'd never caught him staring, but then again, she hadn't been trying to catch him. If that made sense. The worst part was that she really had no choice but to keep wearing the shorts. She'd only brought one pair of sweatpants with her, and she couldn't exactly wear those every single day. Besides the fact that Naruto would undoubtedly notice, it was also just plain gross. She could go home to grab more clothing, but she wasn't that confident in her ability to sneak into her room unnoticed by her mother and father. Ino sighed and took a bite from her ramen, leaning back against the couch. What was the big deal? She was used to guys checking her out. Hell, she liked it when they checked her out, and found it strange if their eyes didn't linger on her legs or for that extra second or two. Besides giving her a small confidence boost, it also assured her that she was still the hottest shit in the village. Shaking her head, she attempted to smile. She was being stupid. This was Naruto. Knowing him, this whole thing was a big, elaborate joke just to make her uncomfortable. Pranks were what he was known for, after all. Besides, he only had eyes for Sakura if his behavior every time she was brought up was any indication. This would all blow over within a couple of hours tops. Dinner's ready, she called, trying to put all of the afternoon's awkwardness behind her. Remembering that he was supposed to be taking a nap, she hung her apron over the handle of the oven and walked over to his room door, knocking on the thin piece of wood with the back of her knuckles. Naruto, dinner's on. She heard a slight shuffling behind the door before it opened to reveal a groggy and slightly red-eyed Naruto. With him standing so closely in front of her, she for the first time realized how much bigger he was than her. She actually had to tilt her head back to look him in the eyes. Thanks, he yawned, running his hand through his sleep-ruffled locks. Ino stared at him for a few seconds before abruptly turning around and heading towards the table. It was no use. The awkwardness was still there and seemed to be growing with each passing second. Although she tried to forget about it, she still couldn't help but wonder if he was staring at her as she walked in front of him. She seated herself at the table and grabbed her chopsticks, waiting for Naruto to sit down before she put her hands together and bowed her head. Itadakimasu. Naruto tiredly mimicked her actions, exaggeratedly bowing his head until his forehead almost touched the table. They both began to eat at the same time, quietly chewing their meal. She'd been too tired to make anything complicated, so she'd thrown together a simple stew made of leftovers and rice. After a few awkward minutes, Ino glanced up from her food to look at him. Hey, about this afternoon. As if he'd suddenly been given a shot of caffeine, Naruto straightened his back and grinned excitedly at her. This is awesome. What's it called? Naruto. I am not Sakura. You can't dangle a compliment over my head and expect me to lose my train of thought. The slight widening of his eyes amused her. Apparently, he hadn't expected her to call him on his bullshit. Leveling her gaze on him, she put down her chopsticks to show him that she wanted his full attention. About this afternoon. Continuing to eat, Naruto shrugged his shoulders. It was a joke. I didn't think you'd take it seriously. A relieved sigh slipped past her lips. Either he was better at lying than she thought, or he was telling the truth. Since she really didn't want to picture him staring at her, she decided to believe him. That's all I wanted to know. It's just that, it'd be awkward if you actually did have the hots for me since we're living together and all. Naruto frowned, obviously displeased with something she'd said. I can admit that you're pretty, but that doesn't mean I'm attracted to you or anything. Not every guy drools after the first pair of legs that walks by. A bit taken aback by his sudden scathing remark, Ino's eyes hardened in anger. Are you saying that's all I am? Take it how you want. Normally, his words and attitude wouldn't have affected her. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to pass her off as a mindless dude to the clothing she wore, and while she wasn't happy about it, she was certain that it wouldn't be the last. However, coming from Naruto, the words seemed to rip a gaping hole in her chest, probably because he was supposed to be her friend. She usually had impeccable self-control over her emotions, but it was all she could do to keep her eyes from moistening and her lips from trembling. So, glaring him straight in the eyes, she uttered one simple phrase. You. Ino abruptly stood from the table and turned around, heading towards her bedroom before she fully lost her composure. She didn't get it. Just when they were getting along. Just when they'd found some common ground. It was always one step forward and two steps back with him. Of course, he wasn't the only one to blame. The two of them both had aggressive, belligerent attitudes, and it was inevitable that they'd clash viciously and frequently. However, she never in her wildest dreams imagined that they'd fight over something so pointless. Thanks for the food, Naruto mumbled to her closed door, standing to put both of their dishes in the sink. Although she heard him through the door, Ino refused to reply. As soon as she passed the test, she was out of there, and there was nothing anyone could do nor say to make her stay with that pompous asshole. Ignoring the hollow ache in her heart, Ino burrowed herself into her sleeping bag, hoping her dreams at least would keep her from thinking of Naruto. She and Naruto weren't actively fighting, but there had been an obvious tension between the two of them for the past 4 days. Unless it was absolutely necessary, they didn't speak. She still made him dinner as per her agreement, but much to her chagrin, he had stopped complimenting her and made sure to eat with as stony of a face as he could manage. They didn't even study in the same room anymore, as Naruto would simply take some books and retreat to his own bedroom. Strangely, though, popping noises and smoke would seep from the edges of his closed door, making her curious as to exactly what kind of studying he was doing. Ino sighed and rubbed at her forehead. The test was only a day away, and here she was thinking about a stupid argument that had started because of a stupid misunderstanding. However, there was no way she was going to cave first. No way in hell. Shaking her head, she tried her best to focus on the words in front of her. The test came first. After she passed and proved to her father that she was more than capable, she could go home and never have to see Naruto's immature face ever again. The sound of the kitchen faucet distracted her, and she tilted her head back to see the boy she'd been thinking about filling a large glass with water. His eyes stayed focused on the running water, and it was obvious that he was doing his best not to look up at her. Which suited her just fine. He was just a distraction, and would probably hurt her chances more than he would help them. Still, despite her thoughts, she found herself watching him anyway. Naruto was a mystery. It killed her to admit it, but she wanted to know more about him. Even though they'd had an amazing talk before this whole ordeal started, he hadn't really offered anything about himself or his past. What happened to his parents? Did he know who they were? Where did he live before he moved out on his own? How had he turned out so well without anyone supporting him? There were dozens of questions that she wanted to ask, but couldn't. At least not now. Sakura could probably find these things out easily if she really wanted to, but somehow, she doubted that her friend would go through the trouble of coaxing the information out of Naruto for her. Surprisingly, after finishing the cup of water, Naruto looked over at her. Their eyes met for an awkward second or two, and without uttering a single word, he shuffled back to his bedroom. Her first reaction was to call out to him. Make him stick around for a little bit longer. She wasn't used to being alone, as at least one of her parents or teammates were always around to keep him company. Funnily enough, Naruto was the exact opposite. Letting loose a short breath of air, she closed the book and stood to her feet, deciding that she'd crammed as much information into her head as she could. The test was tomorrow morning, and she'd much rather go to bed early and get up with enough time to throw together some breakfast for herself and Naruto. They may not be the best of friends at the moment, but she still wanted him to do well. Nervousness didn't begin to describe what he felt at that moment. Sitting in the same exact room as the one he'd been in during that first Chunin exam all those years ago, Naruto felt less than confident. Sure, he'd studied his off, and sure, he only needed 10 points less than what was needed to legitimately pass the test, but he couldn't help but feel as though this test would go the same as the previous one. The room was filled with interrogation hopefuls. Most of them seemed to be trying to look like tough guys, exposing their arm muscles, tattoos, and scars for all to see. He almost laughed when he recognized one of the guys as an old classmate from the academy. This particular kid was possibly the biggest crybaby he'd ever met, and had only managed to become a genin after pain had flattened Konoha. Even though the guy had shaved his head and gotten a bunch of tattoos, he still looked like a little bitch to Naruto. Against his will, his eyes shifted to the girl at the end of his row. He was pleased to see that Ino looked just as nervous as he did, if the way she was viciously biting her thumbnail was any indication. Then again, she did have a lot riding on this. If she didn't pass, her ego would be shattered and she'd have to crawl back home a failure. She'd be proving that her dad was right all along, in that she wasn't cut out for the torture and interrogation department. They weren't on the best of terms, but he really didn't want to see her so defeated. The way her eyes had sparkled when she talked about her dreams still haunted him, and the thought of her being unable to reach her goals made his chest ache. As if she'd sensed him watching her, Ino turned her head to look at him. Just like the night before, their eyes met for a few awkward seconds. This time, though, the corners of Ino's lips twitched upwards. Naruto found this small action to be comforting. He felt as if she was telling him, "Good luck." Or, "Do your best." So, forgetting that they were feuding for the moment, he shot her a similar smile and a thumbs up. At that moment, the door to the classroom shot open. In walked Morino Ibiki, followed by Ino's father and a group of relatively normal-looking shinobi. They wore simple flak chunin and junin vests, surprising Naruto a bit. He'd expected them all to be trenchcoat-wearing badasses. Unsurprisingly, Ino's dad instantly picked his daughter out of the crowd of potentials, and Naruto noticed with a wince that the man didn't look too pleased to see her there. In fact, he looked downright furious. Naruto glanced over at Ino to see that she too seemed to notice her father's glare by the nervous frown marring her face. He sure as hell didn't want to be in her shoes at that moment. "Listen up," Ibiki bellowed, instantly grabbing Naruto's attention. The man waited a few seconds for things to quiet down before continuing. "At each aisle, a member of the torture and interrogation team is passing out your tests. Take one and pass it on to the person next to you. Do not turn your papers over until you are told. You will have 2 hours to complete this test, and cheating of any kind will not be tolerated." Naruto noticed that he stared pointedly at both Ino and the lone Byakugan user in the room, not so subtly implying that he'd be watching them much closer than anyone else. "If you speak during the test, you will fail. If your handwriting is unreadable, you will fail." He looked around the room one last time. "You may now turn your papers over and begin the test." Without wasting a second, Naruto flipped his packet of paper over to start the test, figuring that he'd need every second he could get to finish. The test mostly consisted of short answer questions, with a few long answer and multiple choice questions popping up every 5 questions or so. He took a deep breath and grabbed his pencil before carefully reading the first question. "What is the correct procedure for processing and detaining a foreign prisoner?" The blonde blinked. What the hell? He actually knew this one. Heart thumping, he quickly filled in the answer and moved on to the second question. When performing a strip search of a prisoner, what areas of the body need to be examined? He knew this one, too. If things kept going at this pace, he may just be able to pull it off. A quick glance over at Ino showed that she was also flying through the test, face tense and focused as she scribbled down answer after answer. Every now and then she would flip her hair over her shoulder and sigh, and he noticed that she had a nervous habit of chewing on the eraser of her pencil. They had just come upon the 1-hour mark when the first person stood up and walked to the front of the room, placing their paper face down on the desk in front of Ibiki. The way he carried himself suggested that he was certain he'd pass even though they wouldn't get the results for another few days. Shaking his head, Naruto looked down at his own paper. He was around 75% done, pretty damn good considering his track record when it came to tests. Then again, he had secretly used shadow clones to help him study, figuring that if they could help him learn S-rank jutsus, they could help him learn 3 weeks' worth of material in 5 days. Luckily, his theory proved to be correct as he found most of the questions to be fairly easy. Barely 10 minutes since he'd last looked up, he watched Ino walk down the stairs to place her test face down on the desk with the others. As she was leaving the room, her father, Inoichi, stopped her at the door. He couldn't clearly see nor hear what he was fiercely whispering, but he did manage to pick out the words, home, mother, and selfish. Coupled with the frown that appeared on Ino's face, it wasn't hard to figure out the gist of what he'd said. His heart stopped when Inoichi glanced up to look him straight in the eyes, and not wanting to seem overly suspicious, he casually lowered his eyes back to his paper. Inside, his stomach was doing backflips. Did he know about them? The fact that the two of them were living together. Inoichi's glance hadn't been malicious or anything, and since he was still currently living, he figured he was safe, at least for now. While he'd initially been trying to finish the test as soon as possible, he found that he was suddenly in no rush to walk to the front of the room. Inevitably, however, he finished, and with a heavy sigh, he stood to his feet and moved to place his test with the others. Just like he'd thought, Inoichi pulled him aside to talk. "You're a friend of Ino's, right?" the man asked, staring straight into Naruto's eyes. Well, sort of. More like a friend of a friend," he lied, hoping the conversation would end there. He tried to maintain eye contact so as not to seem suspicious, but Ino's dad was scary. While they may not be the best fighters when it came to hand-to-hand combat, the Yamanaka clan's skills were dangerous. Unless you had a mind of absolute steel, they was capable of sucking any piece of information out of you that they wished. There were also rumors that the clan was behind the suicides of certain Wind Country officials shortly after the joint attack by the Sand and Sound on Konoha. Needless to say, nothing had ever been proved, and unless someone in the clan suddenly decided to confess, nothing ever would be. Inoichi, apparently not sensing Naruto's nervousness, nodded his head and continued. "That's good enough. I wanted to know if you'd be willing to talk some sense into Ino's head. She left home a couple of weeks ago and refuses to tell her mother and I where she's staying." Resisting the urge to ask, "Why don't you just find herself?" the young man swallowed roughly and averted his gaze. "I think Sakura would be a much better choice." From the way Inoichi frowned, he could tell that he wasn't too keen on the idea of asking Sakura. Instead, the Yamanaka placed a large, heavy hand on Naruto's shoulder, leveling his gaze on the younger blonde. "Tell you what, how about you just help me keep an eye on her?" Naruto paused. What the hell? Was Ino's dad trying to buddy up to him? While he liked the thought of having the Mindwalker on his side rather than against him, he really didn't want to get any closer to the man than he had to. With all due respect, sir, I really don't think I should get involved in this issue between you and your daughter." Inoichi looked disappointed, but he nodded anyway. "I respect that." Now, Naruto's head was reeling. The way Ino had described her father made the guy seem like some kind of unreasonable monster, but he had yet to make a threatening move towards him at all. He was imposing, yes, but not threatening. Then again, he also didn't know that Ino was currently living in his apartment and hopefully never would. "Thanks, Yamanaka-san. All just." Naruto trailed off, inching towards the door. "Sure. Go ahead." Bowing slightly to Inoichi, he pulled open the door and closed it behind him, relieved that he'd somehow managed to survive with his sanity intact. As soon as he stepped out of the classroom, though, Ino pounced on him. "What did my dad want?" she asked, cornflower blue eyes searching his for answers. Apparently, she'd been watching them talk from the doorway. Deciding it'd be too much trouble to come up with some bullshit story, he decided to just tell her the truth. "He wanted me to keep an eye on you." "Are you serious? He's trying to use my friends to spy on me," Ino exclaimed, fury evident in her tone. Naruto raised his eyebrows. "We're friends now." Looking at him as if he'd just asked the stupidest question in history, the girl furrowed her brows. "Well, yeah, aren't we? I wasn't sure, since you were ignoring me and all." Ino snorted. You weren't trying too hard to talk to me, either. I thought you hated me. Well, I don't. The two of them stared awkwardly at each other for a few seconds, both feeling more than a little stupid about how they'd acted towards each other. That test was kind of stressful, and I'm ready to let loose and have some fun. What do you think? Ino asked, breaking the short silence. Naruto shrugged his shoulders, zipping up his jacket in the process. Sure. What do you want to do? I hear the lake in the park's frozen over. How about we go ice skating? Almost immediately, Naruto's face stiffened. It was the exact same thing he'd suggested to Sakura the night Ino showed up on his doorstep. It almost seemed like too much of a coincidence, but he doubted Ino would suggest they go ice skating just to spite him. Forcing a smile, he nodded. Sure. Ino's face momentarily lit up before dropping into a frown. Oh, shit, I forgot. My skates are at home. Well, since your dad is here, you should be able to sneak by your mom, right? Ino snorted. You'd think so, wouldn't you? My mom has some kind of daughter sensor that goes off whenever I'm within 20 feet of her. She'd notice me right away. What if I get them for you, then? Naruto suggested. Ino paused. Allow Naruto to go into her room without her there to monitor him. Every one of her senses were telling her that it was a bad idea. Even if he was more naive and innocent than most, he was still a guy, and all men seemed to have the uncontrollable urge to raid a woman's underwear drawer. Still, though, ice skating had been her idea. Besides, she could see his movements from the opposite rooftop. She wouldn't be able to see everything, but hopefully the fact that she'd only be 20 feet away would be enough to deter him from swiping a pair of her panties. Quote. Fine. But if you touch anything, I'll kill you, Ino spat, crossing her arms over her chest. Confused as to what she meant, he'd have to touch her skates to get them, right? He shrugged his shoulders and nodded, following her as she led the way to her home. Naruto landed on the roof of the Yamanaka flower shop, looking around to make sure no one was watching. It'd be hard to explain why he was essentially breaking into the house of one of the members of the Yamanaka clan. He glanced back at Ino, noticing her frowning at him from the opposite rooftop. She raised her hand and deepened her scowl, reminding him that he only had 5 minutes to go in and out of her room. It was painfully obvious that she didn't trust him, but he really didn't understand why not. What was so important that she didn't want him to see? Or did she think he was going to steal something? Shaking his head, he opened her window and slipped through it, being as quiet as humanly possible. Before he even had the chance to look around, he could tell that this room was Ino's. The strong scent of wildflowers immediately punched him in the nose, almost causing him to cough and gasp for air. He normally liked the smell, but not when it was this suffocating. It took a few seconds, but his nose eventually adjusted enough for him to begin looking for her skates. The room was in perfect order, everything seemingly in its place. The walls were a light lavender, and her bedspread was a darker, redder violet. If there was any doubt in his mind before that this room was Ino's, it was gone now. It was surprisingly plain considering the girl's loud and flamboyant personality, but perhaps she was like him in that she preferred to live more simply. Naruto walked around her room in slight awe, realizing that this was the first time he'd ever been inside of a girl's room. He ran his hand over the dozens of perfume and makeup bottles sitting in front of her vanity mirror, and he even leaned down to smell a few of the ones that looked interesting. He then moved over to her bedside table to look at the pictures perched neatly on its surface. There was the obligatory picture of Asuma, herself, Shikamaru, and Choji as Genin. Next to that was a picture of them as Chunin, and on the opposite side of the first picture was a photograph of the Konoha 12, minus Sasuke, plus Sai, standing in front of the Hokage Tower after the Akatsuki had been decimated. He also noticed a picture of a toddler Ino and her parents, all three of them smiling widely at the camera. It was hard to believe that the young, hip blonde guy in the picture was the same large, overbearing bear he'd exchanged words with barely half an hour ago. Remembering his mission, Naruto floated over to her closet to begin looking for her ice skates. According to Ino, they were on a shelf in the top left corner next to some old stuffed animals. He spotted them within seconds, but just as he was about to reach for the shoes, a flash of bright purple poking out of her dresser caught his eye. Curiosity getting the better of him, he grabbed the purple cloth and pulled, only to be smacked in the face by the item. "Ack," he said, rubbing at his stinging eye. "What the hell?" He stared at the object for a few seconds before realizing exactly what it was, her bra. Resisting the urge to throw it across the room, Ino would definitely notice, he quickly stuffed it back into the dresser, but not before glancing at the tag sticking out of the back. 34C, he mumbled appraising LY, a bit surprised that they were that large. She was more than a full cup size larger than Sakura. Never mind how he knew how large, or small, the medic nins were. Suddenly feeling a little too much like his perverted former senseis, Naruto reached up and grabbed her skates before he did something that would get himself killed. Without so much as a second glance, he slipped out of the window and hopped over to where Ino was waiting. "You got them," Ino cheered, a bright smile flashing across her face. Just as quickly, her face fell into a menacing glare. "You didn't touch anything, did you?" Naruto almost choked. Almost. However, reasoning that there was no way she could have seen him from the window, he decided that bullshitting would be the best course of action. "I was only in there for a few minutes. Would I have had time to touch anything?" She eyed him suspiciously for a few seconds before sighing. "I guess not." Not noticing the relief that poured into Naruto's face, she turned around and sped off towards the park. "I'll race you, cheater," he yelled after her, quickly giving chase. As he ran, he felt the smile on his face grow wider and wider. This was going to be fun. "When was the last time you went ice skating?" Naruto asked, looking down at Ino. The girl was currently holding onto his arm for dear life, struggling not to fall for the 100th time. Ino poked out her bottom lip. "Hey, it's only cold enough to ice skate a few weeks out of the year, and I'm a busy girl." "Well, you'll never get any better if you keep clinging to me like this. Here." He removed himself from her grip and skated away, leaving her to fend for herself. Predictably, she immediately lost her balance and began to topple towards the ice. Just before she fell, however, he appeared behind her and caught her by the underarms, hoisting her back up into a standing position with ease. She looked over her shoulder and glared at him. "Asshole." Her anger was quickly replaced by surprise when his cool hand found hers in a comfortable grip. "Relax, I've got you. We're just gonna skate like this for a while until you get the hang of it. Okay, remember, don't look down. Just keep your eyes straight and concentrate on using the sides of your blades to push." Still in a mild state of shock, Ino slowly nodded her head. She quickly glanced around at the other people skating and hanging out near the lake, wondering how they looked to everyone else. Not that it mattered, but she wouldn't want any strange rumors getting back to her friends or parents. Especially not her parents. Luckily, it seemed as if no one was paying them any attention, so she sighed and relaxed like he'd suggested, deciding to just enjoy being led around the makeshift rink. His calm demeanor was rubbing off on her, and before long, she didn't even have to think about pushing the sides of her blades against the ice. "You're doing great, Ino," Naruto yelled from behind her, snapping her out of her thoughts. She hadn't noticed, but sometime within the last few seconds she'd been skating on her own. Fully realizing what that meant, she suddenly and promptly fell on her butt. "Why'd you stop? You had it," he asked, skidding to a stop in front of her. Annoyed, Ino leaned back on her hands and frowned up at him. "Thanks for letting me fall. How did you become king of the ice, anyway?" The young man laughed, turning around to skate backwards in circles around her. "It took me 3 winters of hard work and falling on my to get this good. You're smarter than me and have better balance, so you'll be able to pick it up much faster. Plus, you have an awesome teacher. Wait, You mean no one taught you? Did you learn together with your friends? She asked, furrowing her brows. Naruto shrugged his shoulders. I didn't really have friends. I just spent a lot of time watching other people, so after a while, it eventually sunk in. Sorry, Ino murmured, not sure what she was apologizing for. She'd known he was an orphan, but she figured that he at least had some form of a support system. After all, how could a child raise himself? The thought of a child cooking, cleaning, and buying his own things was unfathomable. Naruto had to have had some help from someone. The young man shrugged again. It's okay. I mean, when I finally got it, it was the best feeling I'd ever felt in my life. It taught me that you could do anything with hard work and a strong will. Ino smiled and raised her hands to him. Help me up. I'm going to get this even if it kills me. Ah, Ino sighed, leaning back in Naruto's bathtub. After 3 straight hours of falling on her, skating, and falling on her, she had finally gotten the hang of basic skating. While she wasn't nearly as agile or fast as Naruto, she could now skate comfortably at his side with little to no effort. She was amazed by the patience he'd shown in teaching her. Though he laughed at her every now and then, he never got upset or frustrated whenever she did something wrong, and even encouraged her every step of the way. His attitude had been completely different than what she'd expected of him. Ino dunked her head under the water. The more she learned about Naruto, the less she understood. Sakura had always described him as loud, brash, and impatient, but the man she'd been living with for the past couple of weeks had been almost the complete opposite. Which Naruto was the real one? The one that only she apparently knew, or the one that everyone else knew? Did anyone else even know that he had 2 sides? Re-emerging from the depths of the bathtub, she sighed and pulled her wet bangs out of her face. God, he was frustrating. Her natural curiosity and his unwillingness to say much about himself were a horrible match, and if she spent another week with him, she was worried that she may drive herself crazy trying to understand him. She pulled the stopper out of the tub and stepped out to dry off, deciding that she'd taken long enough. Naruto was probably more tired than she was since things like tests weren't his strong point, and he'd spent a lot of energy teaching her how to ice skate. Bath is free, she said, dabbing at her damp hair with a towel as she walked into the living room. Naruto downed the rest of his cup ramen in one gulp and nodded, standing from the couch and throwing a towel over his shoulder as he strolled to the bathroom. Ino claimed his recently vacated spot on the couch, finding the heat he left behind to be extremely comfortable. Since she was too exhausted to really fuss with her hair, she decided to simply braid it up into 2 pigtails. Her fingers nimbly separated and entwined her hair, using the skill that had been taught to her years ago by her mother. Just as she was finishing up, Naruto opened the door and emerged from the bathroom. Done already? She asked, using a piece of ribbon to tie off her braid. When he didn't answer, she lifted her head to look at him, only to notice that he was staring at her blankly. What? Pigtails? He said, expression remaining the same. Mistaking his statement for an insult, she frowned. They're convenient. No, I mean, I like them. Oh. Feeling as if she should say something else, she averted her gaze and shrugged. They only took like 2 seconds. When Naruto continued to stare, she found herself rambling. It keeps my hair from getting frizzy, but I don't like to do it all the time because it gives me split ends. They look nice. Thanks. Naruto stared at her for a few more seconds before coughing and finally looking away. Since it's been a long day, I think I'm just going to turn in. Yeah, me too. She stood up and yawned, shuffling over to her bedroom. Good night. Night, he replied, doing the same. Just as she was about to enter her room, Ino paused. There's something that still bothered her, and she felt that if she didn't say it now, she'd never work up the courage to say it again. Naruto. When he turned his head and shot her a quizzical look, she continued. Next time, I mean, if we do ever fight again, let's not do this. Not talk, I mean. It's stupid. Yeah, He opened his mouth as if to say something else but promptly shut it, piquing Ino's curiosity. Night, he said again, entering his room and closing the door behind him. Ino watched him leave with a frown. What was he going to say? The look on his face had been one of confusion and uncertainty. Even though it had probably been nothing, she couldn't shake the feeling that he'd had something important to say. Something that would give her a little more insight into who he was as a person. It was at that moment that she decided. She would figure out the puzzle that was Uzumaki Naruto.